and welcome back to Lamb Talk. This is the 6th interview, and I'm going to introduce to you a gentleman named Les Probert, and he was a very young immigrant from England after the Second World War, and in his early 20s he worked for my grandfather on Matahora Station, and in subsequent years Les and his wife purchased the farm from my grandfather and the estate, and he has continued to farm, and he's going to tell us the story of how my grandfather, Mr. Ross Lange, came to be a sheep farmer, and the story behind Matahora and how it is today. And we are visiting Les in his new home on Matahora Station, on the road between Napier and Wairoa. And let's take a listen.
If we go back to, say, 1920, that was when the first lot of returned soldiers from the First World War returned home, and the government started up a land settlement program. Mm-hmm. But it was very primitive in those days. The Second World War settlements were different. They had houses and sheepyards and cowsheds and all that sort of thing. On the First World War settlers, they were given a block of land, and this particular area here was 1,070 acres, and it was just ring fenced with a boundary fence right round it. It was covered in scrub. It had a small hut, which I'm not sure they built it themselves, but if they didn't, it was very basic.
Was that the worry that they always talked about?
That's right.
I understand Grandpa built that when Grandma
came up. They would have arrived here, or Ross Lange would have arrived here with nothing except the block of land.
Wow.
And so he, according to what I remember and what he told me, he settled down, and as you say, he built the hut and got a garden growing and that sort of thing. There was no water supply. There was a spring across the road seeping out the ground, and he dug that out and cleaned it and used to carry the water back in a bucket. And so that was the start. And then he met, I don't know how or when he met Winifred, not sure what her name was.
Winnie Fantham?
Fantham, exactly. I remember that name because there was a sugar ball on the table, a silver sugar ball with the name Phantom on it, and that was a tennis trophy for a brother had won or something. Oh, okay. But anyway, that's by the by. So he was married, and then he told me he brought his, she arrived in Napier, he picked her up in the gig, because there was no motor cars in those days, and no electricity, no telephone, nothing like that.
No cell phones and Facebook?
No, nothing at all. And so he drove her back from Napier, and I think he might have gilded the lily a bit. I think he might have told her about this big block of land that he owned and that sort of thing, and he said the nearer he got to the farm, the lower his heart was sinking, and he said he pulled up the horses outside the little hut and said, "Oh, well, here you are, Winnie, there's your case, isn't it cleared off for a while?" to deal with it. And
I've got something to do in the back blocks.
But amazingly enough, he said she just fitted in like a glove. And apparently a week or two before, he'd got a local neighbour, Dougal McMillan was another settler, and he said to Dougal, "Come and give me a hand to clean this hut out, Dougal." So these two bachelors got busy, and what they thought, they cleaned it out. And but when Mrs. Lange arrived there, as soon as Ross arrived, she said, "Ross, this place is absolutely disgusting. I've got to spend some time cleaning it out." And so he said he didn't argue. So that was when they arrived here, and it was pretty tough for them. Didn't have any stock. They got a milking cow and so on. And as the years went past, they expanded. Before that, they'd a local person had, when they were ready to get sheep on the property, a local big farmer around here had lent them money to buy stock, so they had a stock mortgage. And they were running a few stock and trying to make their way and planting trees. They were great tree planters. They planted all sorts of trees and shrubs and that sort of thing. Ross Lange had a horticultural background, and he was a great gardener. and he loved his garden, and she did also. And in its heyday, the homestead here was a absolute picture. There was a lot of weddings and 21sts and that sort of thing. They built a tennis court, but that was well into the future. So then the Depression came upon them in 1933, and no one had any money. And so these people that had lent them the money for the stock arrived and said, we're taking over your farm. And he said, that'll be the day. I said, well, you pay your mortgage. He said, no, not paying any mortgage. He said, it's a stock mortgage. There's the stock you removed. So they removed every head of stock, even the milking cow and the pet lamb. And they just left him with the farm, with nothing.
Wow.
So then he went along to what we called in those days land and surveys, what did they call themselves? It was the banking arm of the government land and survey, and so they lent him enough money to buy more stock.
Mm-hmm.
He already mortgaged to the government for the farm, so these people couldn't take the farm. They thought they could, but they couldn't. And so that was a pretty rough time that he went through. And so they finished up being mortgaged to the government, and they had about a 35-year mortgage, I think, but they didn't have to pay anything off until the end of that time if they didn't wish to. So but he decided to pay off so much each year.
Mm-hmm.
And when I worked here, he actually, it was the 35th year, I think, and he went and paid the final payment off in that 35th year. And
Wow.
because I remember him coming back saying, after all these years, the farm actually belonged to him, or belonged to he and Winnie. So, so that was
What year was
basically,
that, Les?
well, when I was here, so it would have been 50, in the mid-1950s anyway.
Okay.
Yeah. So he finished paying his mortgage off. So then he, of course, there was a whole lot of stuff, going further back than that. All the development of the farm, it was all done with, the early development was done with horses and a single, what they called a hill country plough, which ploughed one furrow, and then you tip it over, clicked over, and then you plough a furrow back. And so he was able to plough around the sides of the reasonable hills and that sort of thing, and put a bit of fertiliser on and that sort of thing. Cut the scrub, which just continued to grow, Manuka scrub, and then aerial top dressing came in, of course, and that he said that was the miracle of farming, because they were able to fertilise the whole of the place
Right.
from the air. And so he farmed, and he was very successful too. He was a funny guy. I worked for him for about 4 years, and a great family. I lived in the house, didn't live in the house, had my meals with them, and he treated me like his son. But he expected good value for the money that he spent, because he'd grown up in that era. During the Depression, they would straighten out staples and nails and save every little bit of it. He was like a squirrel. He used to hoard everything. And I remember every now and then I would have a clean-up, and he'd come and he'd say, "What have you done with so-and-so?" I said, "It's all down the dump." "Oh, yeah." So he'd get the boy. He'd say, "Come on, Charlie, grab the tractor and trailer," and they'd go down the dump and cart half of it back.
Oh, no.
And he'd say, "If you keep anything long enough, it'll come in useful," which is probably right. But
Yep.
I said, yes, and the whole place will look like a rubbish dump. But he was a very tidy man, I must admit. Yeah, so they gradually, from the early days, they built, they had the homestead and they built onto it as they could afford it, and added more gardens and shrubs and that sort of thing. And then they started their family. He always wanted a boy, of course, and it didn't come about. He had 3 girls, and which I think was a bit of a disappointment to him. But nevertheless, that was the way it worked out, and they all became nurses and were away during the war and so forth. And he was a good family man. They were good family people. The thing that I remember when I was here, and it had happened all those years, with a number of people that used to come and visit.
Mm-hmm.
And it didn't matter if it was a stock agent or whoever. They'd say, "Come on, have a cup of tea." It was always, because it went back to the early days when, people passed by and they had a long way to go. They always give them a cup of tea. And so the number of meals and cups of tea and so forth, were absolutely amazing. You might have 20, 30 people in a week come in and have a cup of tea, and he was always interested in what was happening in the outside world. He didn't travel much, like a lot of farmers, but he knew what was happening, and he knew a lot about money. Well, put this, a lot about finance, and he was very good to me. He used to sit me at the table after we'd had tea at night and have a cup of tea, and he'd tell me about his philosophy, and I learnt an enormous amount of knowledge about how to handle money, how to handle your finances, and how to stay out of trouble. And I think I've been reasonably successful. I'm at the stage now where he was in his, late 70s. He owned his own farm, and he didn't owe any money, he had no mortgages, he was independent, and I'm at the same stage now. And I think that I put it back to him. Wow. Because he had a very simple philosophy about money, which a lot of people don't have. And he said, if you spend more than you earn, you're heading for trouble unless you're able to pay it back. But if you've got a mortgage and you've got an overdraft at the bank, you're in real trouble because you're paying your overdraft payments out of your mortgage. So he said you can have an overdraft or you can have a mortgage, but it's very poor business to have both. And I've always remembered that, and it's true. It's really true, because if you have a mortgage and you're paying big mortgage payments, then you have a bad season and you have to go into overdraft. Not only are you paying interest to the bank, but you're paying your mortgage payments, which have got interest on them, out of money you're already paying interest on. So it accumulates.
Right.
A lot of people don't think about it. But so he had these simple philosophies. He didn't used to be a very good reader. Well, like he could read and write, but he never read books. But Mrs. Lang used to, whenever they went to town, she'd pick him up a book, and there was generally books about world leaders or, interesting sort of books. And he became a great reader, and he had a lot of knowledge about the world and the way it worked and that sort of thing. So they stayed on the farm. I was there for 4 years, and he stayed there as long as he could. And then he had managers on, and I became a trustee and looked after the place for him. And I eventually leased it from him because he thought at the time that Sally's children might come back, one or two of the boys, but they weren't interested. So he leased it to me, and I eventually purchased the place. It's got a long history, long and interesting history, and something that will never be repeated.
No.
It was hard work. They went without, and in the hut, Mrs. Lange, she had fruit boxes and bought gingham and nailed it around the side and put a nice topping on it and that sort of thing. But that was the way they lived.
Right. Right.
And but they finished up with a very good standard of living, and every now and then she would save the eggs from the fowls, and she sold them. That was her, and cream and that sort of thing. And then she'd save that money, and then she'd buy a little bit of antique furniture. And so she had some very nice furniture, which she'd purchased herself. The other thing too, which is probably interesting, that in the early days, of course, you've arrived here today and there's a brand new bridge across the gorge and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But in those days, of course, there was just a narrow road through the gorge that horse and gigs used to come through, and then it was widened and then eventually sealed. But they were on this place when the original railway viaduct was built, and that was I think it was in the early 1920s. And he said one of the reasons they survived, he was a great gardener. He had a big area of fruit trees, particularly apple trees, and he grew a lot of vegetables, and they had a lot of fowls and milked cows. When I arrived here, they were still milking about 20 cows, which he said was paying the wages and that sort of thing. And so when they built the viaduct, the railway viaduct, there was a big camp of workers on each side of the gorge, and he used to keep them supplied with potatoes and beef and milk and eggs and sold them to them. That gave them enough money to sort of survive some very tough years.
Right. Right.
And Mrs. Lange, of course, she had a lot of fowls, and they used to grow their own feed for them and so on. Very self-sufficient, very self-sufficient. She was a marvellous cook. She could do anything, cream cakes, You know, the whole lot. Marvellous cook, and
Right.
there was never anything wasted. But you know, she could make a meal out of anything. And I think most farmers' wives in those days were the same.
Right.
She wasn't. I mean, if they couldn't, they didn't survive. And so the neighbours next door, all these properties around here were all First World War settlers. And they used to get together and play tennis and that sort of thing, and they all had the same skills and so on. But no, it was quite an interesting lifetime, a long lifetime. I think he died when he was, 89 or something, wasn't he?
Something like that. I was only about 16.
Yes. He moved off the place when he was probably in his mid-70s, and he had a number of managers on, and he used to come up on a regular basis and go around the place on the back of the tractor and keep an eye on it, and until it got to the stage it was inevitable that it would have to be sold.
Right.
And so I was the one that bought it, which has been very good too.
Well, and it seems fitting too, having worked with Grandpa
Yeah.
and knowing the farm like you did. It was the right. You were the right person at the right time.
Yeah, well, you came along at the wrong time, of course.
I should have been born a boy.
Yeah, well, that wouldn't have mattered. That wouldn't have mattered. He didn't care about that, but there was no farmer in the family. And yeah, so it's got a long history, this farm, and it's probably got a long history in front of it, unless it's sold for forestry. It's still 1,000 acres. I don't have to go through the gorge any longer.
No.
The old homestead is still there on the other side of the road.
Yep.
And I hope you do go over before you
Oh,
leave.
for sure. We're going to
Just
jump
hop-
the fence and
Just
have
hop
a
over
poke
the
around.
fence and go, and there's the big board fence there, and just hop in behind it and have a look.
Yeah.
And yeah, so that's the once the road went through, of course, that destroyed the wool shed, the implement shed, the old cow shed. When I sold all, I didn't sell the stuff, I gave the stuff to the museum, like in the cow shed, the old two-stem milking plant was still there, just sitting
goodness.
there, and that used to pump the skim milk away down to the yards where we used to keep the pigs, because in those days you had to make money. So I used to milk about 20 cows and sell a thing of cream, a can of cream every second day, and then the skim milk, because it was separated there, skim milk used to be pumped down to the pigs, and then he'd rear about 40 or 50 porkers every year, and he'd sell those around about the beginning of December, I suppose, ready for the Christmas trade. And so he had this sort of source of income of the pigs and the cows and that sort of thing. And he always said that we always employed a lot of people, really. It was myself and the boy on the place. And he always said that paid the wages, and so the rest of the place, farm was run, as a separate entity, really.
Right. Right. He could put his profits back into the farm that way.
He had a lot of skills too. He had a lot of common sense, and like pigs, for instance, he was a great farmer of pigs. He knew exactly what to do with them, and I learned to do the whole lot, and castrate them and all that sort of thing. And so he had a lot of skills, and same with stock, and he knew what he wanted, and he knew what he wanted to do. And I was just saying to the guy that works for me, there's a young fella here today wanting to buy a farm, and Ross Lang used to say, Les, on a farm like this you always need something to sell. And what he meant by that was that if anything happened, say the tractor broke down or something, and it was a bit of a hard year, you could always, if you had a few fat cows, send them in, because he hated overdraft. Send them in, or a few steers, or a few lambs, or a few ewes, or a handful of pigs, and he said always have something to sell, and he always did. On a regular basis we'd be putting stock, and he had a regular income coming in. So, he had these sort of homespun philosophies, and he was quite funny in a lot of ways, because I was pretty cheeky when I was young, and I knew everything.
When you were young? Has anything changed?
When I knew everything. I knew everything, without a doubt. I came because I'd always worked on big sheep stations, and when I came here, of course, I had to learn everything, fencing and working on a smaller place. 1,000 acres to me was just a holding paddock. Some of the places I worked on had paddocks like this, as a matter of course. And but anyway, he took me under his wing, but I knew everything. So I'd say, I'm thinking Morgan's favourite term. When I think back, it was mine too. In my opinion, and so Morgan must have inherited from me. So we'd sit at the table after tea, and the old table is still in the house. I must bring it up. Remember the oval oak table that we used to have?
It's still in the house?
Yeah, I've got to remove it before it's sold. Oh, but anyway, we'd sit at the opposite side of the table, and he used to smoke his pipe, you see, and he'd spend hours just stuffing it full of tobacco and trying to get it going. And he'd say, "What are we going to talk about, boy?" He always called me boy. And I'd say such and such. And then we'd get into an argument about, not a serious argument, discussion about something. And I'd say, well, in my opinion, and what we should be doing is this. And then Mrs. Lange would come out and say, "You people keep your voice down, you're annoying me." So. But when I think back, he was just leading me on. He knew what to do, he knew what to sell, and you know. But he enjoyed having new ideas, I think, and he never held me back. Sometimes I'd say, "Well, I think you're doing the wrong thing with that mob of sheep." Because he'd say perhaps, "Oh, I'll hang on to them for another couple of months and the price will possibly rise." And I'd come back and say, "I think you're doing the wrong thing with that mob of sheep." Why? Because they're eating grass now. We should be saving for later on. If grass doesn't grow later on, you might get more money for them later on, but you'll have eaten grass we could do with now. So he'd say okay, and he'd either agree or he didn't agree. And I remember one year we had extra hoggets, which are sheep a year old, to carry through the winter, mainly for their wool. And he said to me, "How many we've got?" And I told him. He'd say, "Oh, well, hang on to those." And I said, "We can't. We haven't got enough feed for all of them." "No, they'll be right, boy. It's going to rain and we'll get some grass." And anyway, so we hung on them through the winter, and I managed by hook or by crook to bring them through the winter. And then when we saw them, he said, "Come and have a look at this." And we had the sheets for the wool weights. He said, "They're about nearly a pound a head down." I said, "Well, I told you, didn't I?" I said, "You can't grow wool on a sheep if you don't give it enough to eat." And I've been battling away to bring these sheep through the winter. And now you haven't actually made any money. You're a pound of wool short on every sheep, and that's cost you. And he'd say, "Oh, I suppose you could have been right, boy. I suppose you could have."
Boy.
Yeah. Mm.
I can just hear him.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, he was a hard case.
Oh, he was.
And he delighted in dressing as if he didn't have a dolly, and he had an old coat, and he either had a big safety pin in it or a nail hooked through, and baggy old pants, and he'd say to Mrs. Lange, "Well, put a patch on his pants, Mum." No, put a patch on them. And of course he had a lot of visitors, and he'd go to the door, and he looked like Charlie Chaplin in some ways, and you know, and he didn't mind. He said, "Never let people think you're better off than you really are, Les." Told me a story when he got his first car, and it was a nice shiny car, and he went down to the village and get some stores or something. He was turning around and coming back, and a bunch of kids coming out of school, and they yelled out, "There goes Rich Ross Lange." And he said it made his day, because he said he really didn't have a dollar left.
It was all in the car.
Yeah, so he was a character. Yeah, and he married the right lady, of course.
Oh.
But I don't think there's anything else I can add to that. I've got stuff here which you can take and go through later on.
Right, right. Oh, that'd be awesome.
So what we haven't left now is a 1,000 acre property, which is by and large the property.
Right.
A house on the other side of the road, and the brand new road and the brand new bridge, which has made an enormous difference for people coming through.
That's what they say. They say officially it took 6 minutes off the trip, but the safety factor is huge.
Yeah, and it got to the stage with logging trucks. You know, there's 100, I forget how many trips coming through here every week, hundreds of them. Wow. With these what they call long logs now, and they're 35 metres long. And so prior to that, they were just short logs, and you could get round the corners in the gorge. But if you were coming up this side of the gorge, you know, a long logging truck was coming down. Of course, for them to get around a sharp corner, the tail end
would encroach on the other side.
Across onto the other road, and sometimes it was a squeak to get past. So
right. Wow. Well, we saw that big new intersection where they're heading off to the
Willow Flat.
Is that where it is? Up into the forestry block?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, that's where my wife was born, way at the back there.
Yep.
on the Halliburton property, Matahora Station.
I saw Halliburton Road and I said, I think Les's wife was a Halliburton.
Yeah, and because it was Halliburton's lived up that road, that was where we farmed for 30 odd years.
Does this site in general used to be where the hay shed was?
No, we had 2 or 3 dollars. The big hay shed down there, which you would have seen as you went down by the cattle yards and things. And they got another hay barn over there. No, it's interesting when you look at a block of land, there's nothing on it, and saying, where should we build a house?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And you don't know. So I came up here with a guy who knew what he was doing. I said, well, what I want is a house that virtually gets the sun all day, which it does. Comes up the east, here works its way right around the horizon, and the last of the sun actually shines through the guest room, bedroom windows.
Beautiful.
So it comes right through, and yet it's still cool enough. And in the winter, I've got a fireplace in there, which was a waste of money because I never used it in 2 years.
That's fantastic.
I just used it because I live by myself, and I just use a small heater. But once this place heats up, it just stays.
It's nice.
Modern houses are great. It's all insulated, wall, ceiling, everything.
Yeah, not like the old days. Like the old house
the
built
old,
would have been no insulation.
You wake up in the morning, run your finger down the window, and it was the condensation when you're running down.
Right.
It doesn't happen here. It never happens here. So the modern houses are certainly a huge, huge improvement. And the same with looking after them. This is concrete floor here, and they asked me what I wanted in this area. I said, well, I want a living area near the kitchen where people can sit and have a chat. Got a little lounge in there, which what I call a winter lounge. Got a TV and all that sort of stuff. And then I designed my own bedroom, which is a bedroom almost as long as this, with the bed and shower and toilet and everything in there. But an area up the front with a big, because I do a lot of reading when I get time, with a big bookcase and the armchair. So when I have the kids here, I'll say, that's out of bounds. And if I get sick of them, I can go up there and sit in my armchair and have a read or whatever I want to do. And get up in the morning early, doesn't matter, there's a shower, toilet and everything.
Right.
Then there's another toilet here for visitors that she used. And then there's 2 bedrooms and another bathroom and shower and toilet around the corner. So
wonderful.
It's ideal for, if you're living here and you have visitors, they're there.
Yeah.
If they want to stay in bed in the morning and you've got to get away early, that's great.
Right.
Yeah, so it came up pretty well, actually. So.
Right.
The only thing, I'm not a housewife, and I possibly should have looked at the kitchen a bit further, and it's a nice kitchen, but the sink should have been over by the window. No, I think.
There's a very modern idea to have the sink in the middle of the kitchen.
Yeah, and if I'd thought about it, because most of the old-fashioned houses had the sink by the window, so that when you were doing the dishes and things, you were looking out on, onto the property and this sort of thing, especially on a farm, and that should have just been left as a sort of a place for having a cup of coffee.
Breakfast island.
That's right. So that's the only thing really I would have altered. Could have done with more cupboards. That old house down there has got cupboards there, and then they got window seats. And when it was quite funny when I came to clean the whole thing out, because we moved out from Katamari to here and brought everything from Katamari. Because we were so busy, we just stuffed everything into cupboards and so on. And when we came to clean it out, it was amazing. I'd actually got a guy up here. They were having a gala Catholic gala in Wairua, and they rang me up and said, you got any stuff? I said, yeah, I've got acres and still stuff. And I went through all, he was quite amazed. I said, no, take it. I just want to get rid of it. And I opened the box and there was a silver tea set in there, and it was black, silver goes black.
Yep.
And so I opened it up and he said, what's that? I said, it's a silver tea set. He said, you don't understand. I said, take it. No one is going to use a silver tea set. I offered a lot of stuff to my daughter and son, and they didn't want anything to do with it. I had a thing with knives and forks, the old, what are those white handles?
The bone handles.
Yeah.
Can't go in the dishwasher with them.
They hadn't been used. I said, take it. So they went away quite happily, and they got $1,000 for the tea set, so they were really chuffed. I probably think the mayor's a multi-trillionaire or something. But
not anymore.
No.
Gave it all away.
Yeah, well, there's all sorts of stuff still in there. I mean, we used to do a lot of tramping. There's packs and sleeping bags and all sort of piled up in the corner of the garage.
Right.
But when you move house, and because when we moved in, the family left a whole lot of stuff there too. They didn't want it, and so when we moved to here, well, Bill and I, we unearthed all sorts of stuff.
Oh.
Newspapers from the First World War. And
Oh my
diaries
goodness! Wow.
Yeah, and,
Well, they're historic now, aren't they?
yeah, they're all stuffed into this plastic. I bought 3 or 4 of those big plastic suitcases that you snap shut, so
Yep. So the mice don't get in.
Silverfish can't get in there or anything like that.
Huh.
So there's a heap of stuff there, not only from this place, but from Janet's father's property too.
Right.
Historical stuff.
So now, just to finish up on the recording, what's your stock carrying now?
There's 1,000 acres left. It's all clear. Some steep country along the river, but it's carrying the equivalent of 5,000 stock units. Stock unit is one sheep is a single stock unit, and a cow or a cattle beast could be anywhere from 2.5 to 6. So if you average them out, it's carrying 5,000 stock units, which actually is quite well stocked up. I didn't realise that I was carrying so much stock. I always thought I was pretty sparsely stocked in some ways, except in the winter. So so it's pretty well stocked. It's an economic unit to the degree. The interesting thing about property like this now, when you look back to 1920, just a block of scrub and that sort of thing, it's been developed and developed and developed, and it's all in grass and been fertilised, and from a block of land that was worth virtually nothing,
Right.
it's now beyond the means of most young
farmers.
people to buy.
Right.
I mean, I was able to buy it because prices were low at that time, and just after 1990 I purchased it, and I paid $480,000 for it, and I owned the stock because I was leasing it. And that was the tractors and everything and fencing gear. I just had a valuer come and said, value the old tractor and machinery and bits and pieces, spades and shovels and that sort of thing. And I'll just, instead of having a sale here, I'll just offer you a price. So the family said, okay. So I had it valued by 2 valuers, even though I was leasing it. The family employed a valuer who came and valued, and I employed a valuer who came and valued, and we reached an agreement. So it was less than $500,000 at the time. The latest valuation is from the government valuation, which is done every 3 years, is $2.5 million.
Wow.
That's land and improved. That's not the stock, of course.
Right. That's just the land.
What happened here when I leased it, and the family were always very good to me, and I'd been supervising it and looking after it for them, and then they leased it to me at a very reasonable price, and then the stock that was on the place, I bought my own sheep here, and there was 250 Hereford breeding cows, so they didn't want all the money straight away because it was going to be a tax burden, they would have to pay tax.
Yep.
So they wanted to spread it over 5 years, so they said to me, well, you will, bail you the stock, so virtually leasing the stock, and pay it off by the end of 5 years. I purchased 50 cows a year, so each year I'd get a valuer in and say, this year, what are 50 breeding cows worth? And they'd give me a value and I'd purchase them. The next year we'd do the same thing, so I wasn't paying the same amount each year. At the end of the 5th year I was probably paying 30-40% more, because that's what the value was. So it worked out very well, and they didn't have to pay all that tax on that money, because they had quite a lot of money put to one side. So I was pretty fortunate, really. It doesn't happen very often.
Right.
Really interesting conversation, and all the best for the future on Matahora Station. And if you want to catch another episode, anyone, you can find us on www.lambshow.com and look at my blog, or on iTunes you can listen. And thank you very much for tuning in. See you around the block.
This show was produced by Wild Inspire Media.